What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to take a look at Testify's Erik Manny as he attempts to defend the feeding of the 5,000 as a famous historical event. Man, I really hope he brings his A game and is ready to defend this crazy-ass miracle. I'm not convinced that miracles are all that likely, and I think that this miracle in particular is technically copied from the Old Testament. Hopefully, Erik can make a believer out of me. If y'all want to fuck around and find out if Erik Manny can defend the feeding of the 5,000 as a historical event, then please stay tuned.
One of Jesus' most popular miracles is the feeding of the 5,000. I'm sure you've heard the story. A young boy gave Jesus 5 loaves and 2 fish and ended up with 12 baskets of leftovers. It's a neat story for the kiddos in children's church for sure, but according to skeptics, it's just invented to make Jesus look like another Elisha.
The fact that the Gospels are full of miracles connected to Elisha and Elijah is well substantiated. These miracles of the New Testament share the hallmark signs of myth-making to include coincidental naming and a reversal of story elements. The genre and length of each of these miracle stories are the exact same as their Old Testament counterparts. Jesus, Elisha, Elijah, they all have miracles where they resurrect people, they heal people at specific places like Capernaum, and, of course, they all perform miraculous generations of food. Not only are the types of miracles the exact same, but the very words used by the New Testament harken back to the Old Testament. It's painfully obvious that the gospel authors, whoever they may be, definitely use the miracles of Elisha and Elijah in order to generate their own miracles for Jesus. Jesus was supposed to be the Mac Daddy prophet, supposed to be better than all the other prophets. So obviously he had to do all the same miracles that the other prophets did, but he had to do them bigger and better. If you want to learn more about the connections between Elisha, Elijah, and Jesus, then you need to download my Christus app. Earlier this year, I put about 10 pages worth of information into the app on this particular subject alone.
In 2 Kings 4, Elisha fed 100 men with just 20 barley loaves, so all 4 gospel writers had Jesus perform the same miracle, but on a much more exaggerated scale.
Well, technically, there are 5 different feedings of thousands of people. Mark has an extra feeding of thousands stuffed into his narrative. This is because the author of Mark came across 2 different versions of the one feeding of thousands, and he thought that they were separate events, so he put them in as separate events. But, again, it's painfully obvious to tell that these 2 accounts are really just different versions of one account. In Mark 6, Jesus is gonna feed 5,000 people with just a few loaves of bread and fish. And the disciples, rightfully so, ask Jesus, hey, how are we gonna feed all these people? And of course, Jesus, being the magician that he is like, poof, fish and bread. And he feeds 5,000 people. Now, after this event, you would think that this particular magic trick would be in the minds of the disciples if they were to ever come across another situation where they don't have enough food for everybody. Jesus could just snap his fingers and miraculously generate food, right? You would think that this would be the first thing on their minds, right? But in Mark 8, we see a duplicate instance of the event happening, complete with the disciples not knowing how Jesus is going to feed 4,000 people. They just sort of bumblefuck around and are like, how are we going to feed all these people there, Jesus? We can't just miraculously generate food, can we? And of course, Jesus is like, oh, goddamn, you dumb motherfucking yes, we can generate food. I just did this a few days ago, dipshits. Now, these disciples act like they did not just witness Jesus the other day provide enough food for 5,000 people. Of course, all of this is easily explained if you understood how Mark saw the disciples, being that they were representative of the tribes of Israel and are thus dumb fucks. That's pretty much one of the themes of Mark's gospel, is that the disciples represent the Jewish people and the Jewish people are dumb. They're incompetent. they're imbecilic. And Mark does this multiple times throughout his gospel. But as a historical event, this makes literally no sense. More to the point, we also know that this feeding of the 5,000 is directly copied from the Elisha narrative, where he feeds a multitude of people with just 20 loaves of bread, because of the story progression in both of them being exactly the same. Both specify the number of hungry people. Both specify the inadequate amount of food. Both have the prophet instruct the disciples to feed the people. And both have the disciples protesting the inadequate amount of food. The story progression, coupled with similar words and phrases used in both accounts, are hard links between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Considering the fact that the feeding of the 5,000 is most definitely copied from the Old Testament, it seems like the most reasonable conclusion to think that the gospel authors just made up this feeding of the 5,000 in order to connect Jesus to the Elisha-Elijah narratives. Regardless of all that, though, it's definitely not a historical event.
But just how likely is it that this miracle has a historical basis? Some of you might think that that's a crazy question, but in my opinion, this narrative has a very strong historical foundation, and the evidence comes in the form of undesigned coincidences.
Oh, undesigned coincidences. Undesigned coincidences have their roots back in the 18th century when it was first hypothesized by William Paley. And then, later on in the 19th century, it was resurrected by preacher J.J. Blunt. And now, in the 21st century, it's being resurrected yet again by Tim and Lydia McGrew. It's being brought back from the dead like a fucking zombie. This argument stipulates that you should forego all scholarship surrounding the authorship and dating of the Bible. And you should take the Gospels as being independent eyewitness accounts of the same events. Also, the authors of the Gospels are the ones that are mentioned in the titles. You know, the ones that weren't applied to the books until the 2nd century, with no evidence that any of them wrote those particular Gospels? Oh, geez, almost sounds like dishonesty. Oh, and hearkening back to that whole independent thing, you have to also assume that all of the gospel writers did not know a thing about what the other gospel authors were writing. All of this is completely ridiculous, of course. We have hard evidence that Mark was written first, and then Matthew came in and redacted Mark, copying directly from him and also adding and changing some stuff. And then we have Luke, who took both Matthew and Mark, combined their texts, added and changed some things to it, and wrote his own account. And then John, knowing all three of the Gospels, came in and wrote his own account, somewhat refuting the previous Gospels. We know all of this because of the internal evidence indicating that Mark was the first one written, and then verbatim copies of Mark appearing in other Gospels. This argument from Undesigned Coincidences requires you to forego all of this information. But weirdly enough, it also requires you to forego some of the information contained in some of the Gospels. And you have to do this in order for the coincidences to work. Don't worry, we're going to cover that shit here soon. This is the reason why this particular argument has remained stagnant and unaccepted even by Christian scholars. It's just a ridiculous hypothesis that should not be taken seriously.
McGrew defines undesigned coincidences as a notable connection between two or more accounts or texts that doesn't seem to have been planned by the person or people giving the accounts. Despite their apparent independence, the items fit together like pieces of a puzzle. These are hard to fake and even more likely to come about by pure chance in fictional or manipulated stories. Fictions and forgeries don't normally converge, or when they do, it's in a very obvious way that is meant to be noticed by the reader. Undesigned coincidences are what we would expect to find in real accounts of the same event told by different people who knew what they were talking about, and when taken cumulatively, they make a very strong case for the reliability of the Gospels.
First of all, he admits that you have to assume that the Gospels are independent. Only then are these undesigned coincidences hard to fake. There is absolutely no apparent independence when it comes to the Gospels. They are so obviously interdependent that you have to willfully ignore all of the evidence in order to accept the idea that they're independent. He also talks about how undesigned coincidences are hard to fake in fictionalized or manipulated stories. But all of that is predicated on the idea that these accounts are independent. There's also kind of a circular aspect to this particular section. You're trying to tell me that you have to assume that they're accurate independent accounts in order to prove that they are accurate independent accounts? That's not how logic works, Erik. You see, this is the problem that I have with Christian apologists. They either have to be flat out lying about this shit, or they have to be willfully ignoring it due to cognitive dissonance. Either way, it means you can't trust a fucking thing they say. Simply put, there are no undesigned coincidences. Later gospel authors copy, redact, and edit the previous gospels. If they're adding information, they are adding to what is already stated in the previous gospels in order to provide a more complete story. If there's different information, then they are correcting what was previously wrote. A good example of this is the story of Lazarus. You see, in Luke, Lazarus doesn't actually get resurrected. What happens is that Jesus tells a parable about Lazarus being resurrected and how it doesn't convince anybody, or it won't convince anybody. Well, John, comes in and he's like, fuck that noise. Nah, Jesus resurrected Lazarus, and a lot of people became convinced that Jesus was the Son of God, or God himself, or whatever in the fuck.
There are dozens of undesigned coincidences in the New Testament, with several of them clustered in the feeding of the 5,000. We'll look at some examples and then discuss some common objections at the end, so be sure to stick around.
There are no undesigned coincidences in the feeding of the 5,000. Like I laid out previously, they copied a miracle from the Elisha narrative and pasted it onto Jesus. And there's at least 5 different versions of this miracle, primarily because this miracle never happened. They are using Elisha's account in order to make up a more magical, more powerful version of that same miracle for Jesus. This is a far more reasonable, rational, and, more importantly, parsimonious explanation for this miracle in the New Testament.
So where did the feeding of the 5,000 happen? We're going to start in Matthew 11:21, and it reads, Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. Now, this might seem like an odd place to start. In this passage, Jesus rebukes Chorazin and Bethsaida for failing to respond to his miracles. But what mighty works is he referring to? Nothing that Matthew has reported up to this point has given us any clue.
This is a very interesting question. Now, how would anybody that's rational and reasonable go about figuring out where this happened, considering Matthew doesn't directly tell us? Well, I would probably start with Matthew's source, Mark. So where does Mark suggest that this feeding of the 5,000 happened? And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. Holy shit, that's a lot of people. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he stuck around and told the crowd to get the fuck out of there. We don't want to see y'all no more. Mark 6:44-45. I'm gonna guess. Hear me out. I'm gonna bet that it probably happened near Bethsaida. Because, that's how sources fucking work, Erik! But also, what do you mean that he hasn't given us any indication as to what he's talking about? Just a couple chapters prior to this in Matthew, he said, Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness, telling them that they're dumb fucks. Matthew 9:35. Of course, he doesn't specifically say that those 2 villages, including Bethsaida, specifically in that. He says all towns and villages, but considering Matthew's source material, I would expect both of those places to be part of all the towns and all the villages. Saying that he hasn't given us any clue as to what he's talking about is just simply wrong, but it does highlight one of the prime components of undesigned coincidences. They must ignore information from the Gospels themselves in order to make these coincidences work. The question of where did this feeding of the 5,000 take place has already been answered.
For the answer, we're going to need to turn to John. John 6:5 reads, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" Now, think about this for just a second. If you had to invent a gospel story, would Philip really be your go-to guy? He's barely mentioned in the Gospels. Peter is featured prominently in all four Gospels, with James and John not far behind, and we know that Judas kept the money bag, and I think we'd also assume that Matthew the tax collector would be pretty good with money too. One thing John does tell us in an unrelated passage is that Philip is from Bethsaida. But what is so significant about that?
So, let me get this straight. In order for you to figure out where this feeding took place, instead of going to Mark, the source that Matthew used, you instead jumped to John, written 20 to 30 years at least after Matthew was written. The same gospel that definitely used Matthew in order to generate that gospel. Why wouldn't you look at Matthew's source to figure this shit out? Oh, yeah, sorry, I forgot. You reject the notion, despite verbatim copies of Mark existing in Matthew, that Matthew didn't know anything about Mark's gospel. And so your answer is to make things even more complicated by jumping to John's gospel, who not only knows about Mark and Matthew, but also Luke, because Luke also affirms that it happened near Bethsaida. When the apostles returned, they reported to Jesus what they had done. Then he took them with him, and they withdrew themselves to a town called Bethsaida and visited a titty bar. Luke 9:10. So, at this point, John doubly knows that the feeding of the 5,000 definitely happened at Bethsaida, or at least near Bethsaida. And he knows all of this before he constructs his gospel. While constructing his gospel, John fabricates this idea that Philip is from Bethsaida. You see, the author of John loves to fabricate stories about Philip because Philip is basically like a blank slate. This is because nobody has used Philip in the past for stories, so obviously it would be perfectly fine to generate an origin story where Philip was born or lived in Bethsaida. This is not an undesigned coincidence. This was definitely designed by the author of John. His audience has already been exposed to the idea, not once, but twice, that this feeding took place near Bethsaida. John literally couldn't have had it taking place anywhere else and be easily accepted by the Christian community.
To put the pieces of the puzzle together, we're going to keep looking. Luke gives us the actual location of the feeding of the 5,000. Luke 9:10 through 11 reads, "On their return, then the apostles told him all that they had done. And he took them and withdrew to a town called Bethsaida. When the crowds heard it, they followed him, and he welcomed them and spoke to them of the kingdom of God and cured those who had need of healing." So Luke doesn't even mention Philip, but tells us that the miracle happened in Bethsaida, Philip's very hometown. In John, Jesus asks the local guy where they could get bread, but he doesn't give away the location. So those are a couple pieces of the puzzle that fall into place.
Well, to be fair, the Gospel of Mark was the first gospel to place the feeding of the 5,000 near Bethsaida. All the other Gospels use Mark in one way or another, so all the other Gospels had to place it near Bethsaida. And he didn't even use Mark for this information. I'm not exactly sure why he's ignoring this evidence, other than he must ignore this evidence in order for his argument from Undesigned Coincidences to even work. And again, John liked incorporating Philip into the story for whatever weird reason. The author of John just literally makes up the whole idea that Philip was from Bethsaida. Nobody else connects Philip to Bethsaida. These are not puzzles that mysteriously fit together. They are completely designed by the gospel authors to fit together. As we've shown, he must ignore some information from the Gospels, and then he cherry picks other information from the Gospels in order to make this argument even work.
And as a result of their refusal to repent, Jesus' harsh response to Bethsaida now makes a lot more sense. Matthew frequently organizes his material thematically rather than chronologically, so he describes the feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 14. But in Luke's account, Jesus pronounced his woes towards Bethsaida shortly after the feeding took place. So there's yet another piece of the puzzle that falls into place.
How exactly does he know that Matthew's account is not chronological? There's no indication given in the Gospel of Matthew that it's not chronological. Normally, we would expect to see some kind of context clues that he is placing things out of chronological order. Like, we went and did this thing, but before we did this thing, we did that thing over there. But immediately after that thing, but before the other thing, we did this other thing. Like, there would have to be some way to indicate to us that it was being placed out of order. What I think that he is doing, and thus Tim and Lydia are trying to do, is they are trying to mesh all of the gospel accounts together in this harmonious package that all relay the exact same story. The problem is, they don't. Because you see, the event, the feeding of the 5,000, happened in a different series of events in both of these accounts. What you end up having to do is speculate that Matthew was writing thematically instead of chronologically. And only in that respect could Matthew have been actually mentioning the feeding of the 5,000 in the exact same time frame as the other Gospels? And all of this is done so that you can make the argument from coincidences work. You simply can't do that. What he's doing is he's fixing the information to get the answer that he wants. Or, well, I guess Tim and Lydia are fixing the information to get the answer they want. And then Erik is just regurgitating what Tim and Lydia say.
And apparently, Jesus took the woes he pronounced on Bethsaida very seriously, because in Mark we read about Jesus healing a blind man from Bethsaida. After Jesus healed him, he instructed him not to even enter the village. But there are no woes pronounced against Bethsaida in Mark's gospel. And so yet another piece of the puzzle falls into place. Are you seeing it now? This is the kind of casual interlocking between accounts that we would expect in historical reporting, but this would be very unusual given the fictionalization hypothesis.
This doesn't explain anything. Jesus didn't want the blind man telling anybody in Bethsaida because he was trying to be super secret about his superpowers, at least at that point in time. And he does it all throughout Mark. In Mark 1, Jesus goes town to town healing people and preaching in the synagogues and everything like that. And then in Mark 1:44, he says, "Shh, see that you don't tell this to anyone. Don't you fucking tell a person." Mark 1:44a. And he says this for the same reason too. Well, you see, Jesus had been going around to the synagogues, like I had said before, preaching and healing people, but he had gained a certain massive notoriety for it. And so everybody was swarming him, asking him to be healed by him and everything. And Jesus didn't want to do that. He wanted to go, preach, heal people, and convert people to the new religion that they were creating. He didn't want to be some rock star televangelist that smacked people with his blazer and healed them. So if he could help it, he could convince somebody not to go and yap and blab about being healed, he was going to urge them not to do it. Of course, the guy he healed didn't do that. He went straight to the town and blabbed his mouth about how Jesus healed me, Jesus healed me. But the point is that Jesus had said this plenty of times prior to this particular instance that Erik is bringing up. What he's doing is he's attempting to connect both Mark and Matthew's gospel as telling the same stories. And so one gospel explains why in another gospel something else happens. But the problem is that they are not the same stories. You see, in Mark, he heals this blind man near Bethsaida after the feeding of the 5,000, prior to the feeding of the 5,000. Matthew is rebuking Bethsaida, not because the feeding had happened or that the miracle of the feeding had already happened near Bethsaida, but it's because these are two different fucking stories. Also in Matthew, there's no blind man that's healed before the feeding of the 5,000. Matthew is copying and redacting Mark. He claims that we should expect this in historical writings, but not out of fictionalized material. Except that he's got to take things out of order, he's got to take them out of context, and basically cherry pick the information in order to make all of this bullshit work. This makes it a dishonest evaluation of the information. If you have to rip things out and disregard other information in order to get your argument to work, you're only proving your ability to create a narrative.
But we're just getting started. Let's look at Mark 6:31, which reads,
Oh, no, we're not going to go through all the supposed undesigned coincidences that both him and Lydia McGruth think exist. They simply aren't undesigned. They are, in fact, designed by the authors of their respective Gospels. And we know this because each author had access to the Gospels prior to their own gospel. They could absolutely construct their narrative around whatever narrative was already in existence. They also took the chance to redact and edit the stories that had already been told. And again, I have to stress that he has to disregard evidence within the Gospels in order to make undesigned coincidence a thing. And this happens with every supposed undesigned coincidence that supposedly exists.
Again, notice how incidental this all is. These undesigned coincidences crisscross all over the four Gospels, and this is just a handful from one story. There are dozens in the Gospels and between Acts and the Pauline epistles, and I definitely recommend that you get McGrew's book to learn more.
They only seem undesigned because he, or rather Lydia and Tim, make them seem undesigned. They crisscross all over the Gospels because they have to cherry pick from each Gospel, and then they gotta reorder the chronology of one Gospel, and all of this is to make the pieces fit together like they're undesigned coincidence. And we have extensively examined this in his search for the location of the feeding. He had to reorganize Matthew's chronology, then he had to speculate about and disregard Mark's Gospel, and totally disregard the fact that the Gospels are interdependent. Do not waste your money on McGrew's book.
So, what are the objections? Well, the most common complaint is that the argument from Undesigned Coincidences fails to acknowledge the synoptic problem. Many scholars think that Matthew was the first Gospel, and then Matthew and Luke copied Mark and also shared a common source known as Q that's now lost to us. Although Matthew and Luke's Gospel accounts have some literary dependence,
yes, that is the main objection to undesigned coincidence. He has to disregard the fact that the Gospels copy off one another in order to make this argument work. Of course, Tim and Lydia McGrew think that the Gospels are independent eyewitness accounts of the events that happened. Thus, they disregard the synoptic problem for no good reason except it hurts their argument. They just hand wave away the synoptic problem as a non-issue, and thus we can just hand wave away their crazy ass idea of undesigned coincidence. And yet we don't hand wave away these undesigned coincidences because we can prove that they don't exist. Also, Q is indistinguishable from Mark. I don't think the Q document ever existed, and speculating that one did exist does not help us at all. It only unnecessarily complicates the issue.
The argument from Undesigned Coincidences suggests that all four Gospel authors frequently had access to reliable, independent information. Lydia McGrew actually addresses this in her book. She writes, "In short, it doesn't matter to the historicity of the Gospels whether, for example, Mark was written first and Matthew and Luke got some of their material from Mark. Even if that is true, it doesn't mean that Matthew and Luke developed from Mark in an evolutionary fashion, or that Matthew and Luke did not have reliable, independent information of their own."
Alright, let's get one thing straight. The argument from Undesigned Coincidence does not suggest that all four Gospel authors had access to independent, reliable information. The argument presupposes that idea. It requires that all four Gospels be independent and reliable, and that they have no knowledge of the other Gospels. This is ridiculous because if they did have access to these kinds of sources, why don't we see them cite these sources? And why did they need to verbatim copy previous Gospels? Lydia just hand waves away the problem yet again and speculates that it just doesn't matter if people copied off of Mark or other Gospels copied off of each other. Why doesn't that matter? I feel like that should matter. Why doesn't she or Erik think that the Gospel authors having access to the previous Gospels would allow them to create or design these stories to fit around the already existing narratives? She ultimately uses an invalid argument from silence in order to justify her speculation that the synoptic problem isn't a problem. It's an invalid argument from silence because if there's no evidence that these independent sources exist, then there's no need to speculate that they did exist. Of course, both Lydia and Erik are willfully ignoring some information from the Gospels themselves in order to fabricate coincidences. and thus cannot substantiate these fabricated pieces of evidence.
Moreover, as I note in several passages, some of that independent information appears precisely at these points where Matthew and Luke seem in many respects similar to Mark. The synoptic problem, nor Mark in priority, are really an issue here.
Why? And not just in many respects are they similar to Mark, they are verbatim copies at certain points. This is acknowledged by nearly all scholars, and more importantly, nearly all Christian scholars. This is like someone writing a book in the Harry Potter universe, but yet it's from Hagrid's point of view during Harry Potter's book series. But they stipulate that this particular set of books about Hagrid are completely independent from the Harry Potter books. It would be ridiculous to claim that, just like it would be ridiculous to claim that the other Gospels didn't use the previous Gospels in order to generate their narratives.
So let's look at another objection. Couldn't these be explained by Gospel writers incompletely copying from a common source that contained both parts of the coincidence? Well, in short, no. No independent evidence exists for such a source. There is a whole lot more that I could say here, but this special source theory seems to be invoked simply to dodge the more obvious explanation.
Oh! Now having evidence matters, does it? Because just prior to this, it didn't matter if there is or isn't any evidence to support the idea that the gospel authors copied off of each other, or that they are or aren't independent. It's only now that evidence matters. Never mind that we have direct evidence that the gospel authors copied off each other. Evidence only matters now because it can help you. True, there is no evidence that such a source exists, but that explanation is far more likely than undesigned coincidences, especially when you consider all of the evidence we've discussed. And, of course, the more obvious explanation would be, the authors copied off each other and designed the stories!
Well, what about oral tradition? Could that explain undesigned coincidences? Well, let's look again at the example of Philip. Could you possibly say that Christians across geographical areas were aware that Philip came from Bethsaida? John was writing in Asia Minor, miles away. It's doubtful they would have known, and although it's possible, I don't think it's very likely. It seems like oral tradition doesn't help us out very much. Most of these details are very casual and incidental, not something that would have been the focus of memorization.
Wait, I thought that the Gospels were supposed to be based off of oral traditions that traced back to eyewitness accounts. How can you say that oral traditions don't matter, but then also say that the Gospels are based off of oral traditions? Kinda seems to me that undesigned coincidences are designed to point out this exact situation which he is attempting to dismiss. Maybe I'm misunderstanding what he's trying to say here, but if undesigned coincidences are meant to point out where two different independent stories coincide with each other in order to verify that some event happened, then it would look no different than this whole idea of oral traditions being meshed together. That fact alone renders this argument useless. And Erik just hand waves away the more likely conclusion. All because it doesn't work for his argument, and that's the only reason why.
The other reply is to offer alternate conjectures that explain undesigned coincidences away one at a time. But the claim being made here isn't that no possible alternative explanations exist. The point is that the existence of undesigned coincidences is much more plausible and probable on the historicity hypothesis rather on the fictionalization hypothesis.
And that's simply wrong. How could undesigned coincidences be more probable on the historicity hypothesis than the hypothesis of designed fictional accounts? We know that gospel authors were editing, copying, and redacting previous gospels. This is a fact. It seems to me that if you had access to the previous author's work and you wanted your audience to readily accept your new version of events, you would incidentally make them coincide. It would make it seem more authentic. This is like looking at a clothes hanger and deciding that it was not designed to hang on a rod in a closet. It just coincidentally does that shit. No, dipshit! Both the clothes hanger and the Gospels were designed to be that way.
While some undesigned coincidences are more powerful than others, they have a cumulative weight when taken together, and it takes a lot more work to multiply explanations, and McGrew's book contains over 24 just from the Gospels alone. After a while, it just becomes an exercise in mental gymnastics in order to save the skeptical hypothesis when a much simpler and less ad hoc explanation is already available.
What the fuck is he talking about? The less ad hoc explanation is that the gospel authors knew about the previous gospels that had been written, so they constructed their narratives around what was already available. In some cases, those later gospels outright refute the earlier gospels. In other cases, they keep the same basic information but change a few things. Like, for instance, Mark places the feeding of the 5,000 near a lake shore, while John places it up on a mountain. How do you get that kind of basic shit wrong if you're an eyewitness? There is a difference between a lake shore and a fucking mountain. Both Lydia and Erik have to perform mental gymnastics in order for their undesigned coincidences to work. Alright, so first they gotta do an aerial over the dating of the Gospels. Then they do a corkscrew over Matthew's timeline issue. Side flip over the second feeding in Mark. Back tuck over the inconsistencies in the other Gospels, and do a double gainer past all of the verbatim copies of Mark in the other Gospels, wolf jump over the lack of independent sources, and then finish with a triple front flip over the no source citation in any of the Gospels. But yeah, I'm the one having to do the mental gymnastics in order to make my hypothesis work, despite all of my evidence is grounded in fact, while they just ad hoc speculate shit.
So in conclusion, the feeding of the 5,000 is more than just a fun story you heard in children's church. It has a very strong historical basis. I definitely recommend taking the time to learn more about undesigned coincidences because they're evidence within your own Bible that's very easy to bookmark, highlight, and share with others.
This miracle literally has no historical basis whatsoever. It was actually copied from the Old Testament miracles about Elisha miraculously generating food. Elijah also did the same thing, but the multiplication of bread seems to fit in well with Jesus claiming to be the bread of life and shit. The connections between the various feeding stories in the New Testament are numerous. They include story progression, structure, and verbatim phrases used in both. It's hard to get around the fact that this miracle seems to be wholly fabricated. Alright, heathens, well, undesigned coincidences don't seem to provide any evidence whatsoever. All they do is show the links that apologists will go to in order to salvage their holy books. In order to make undesigned coincidences work, you have to ignore information, and then you have to cherry pick and force the information to fit together. The argument requires you to dismiss, without good reason, the synoptic problem. It is detrimental to their argument that later gospel authors had access to the previous gospels. They know this, so they just hand wave it away and proclaim that it's not a problem. You actually have to deal with the real issue here. You can't just dismiss the issue without good reason. Yet this is exactly what Lydia, Tim, and Erik all have to do in order to make undesigned coincidences work. Well, heathens, that's going to be it for me today. I hope that you guys enjoyed this somewhat long analysis of the feeding of the 5,000. I know it may seem easy to just dismiss miraculous things, but apologists keep coming up with more convoluted things that take longer and longer to refute. If you will, let me know what you think of undesigned coincidences down below in the comments section. I'd really love to know what you guys think about this particular argument. And hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of video. And as always, don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.